Hello and welcome to the show. Now, those of you that watch my videos regularly will know that I am a rather large fan of NASCAR. Unfortunately, quite a lot of people like to write this sport off without ever really knowing much about it or paying much attention or even watching a race. The cars are, yes, very, very rudimentary. While the ones we have in Forza have got 725 horsepower, they still have 4-speed gearboxes. Only very recently did they change from running carburetors, and yes, they do spend most of their time racing around ovals. But anyone that has done any oval racing will know that these are deceptively tricky places to go racing, especially when you have a large group of cars very, very close together. And let's not forget, twice a year, these cars do go tackle some normal racetracks, Watkins Glen and Sonoma, and these are big, heavy racing vehicles to be tackling that sort of circuit, not the ideally suited cars for that sort of track. Now, when these vehicles were added into Forza, their PI is a relatively low R class. They are right in the midst with all of the GT cars. And that's got me thinking, what would happen if we take these really rather simplistic cars and put them up against various different GT vehicles? Would they really be able to compete around normal racetracks? So, to start off with, we went to, Watkins Glen. The NASCARs actually do race here. It seemed like a good place to start, and it would likely be quite suited to these very, very quick vehicles. As we run through turn one, we had the grid set up for reverse PI order, so theoretically the faster cars would be at the back. Unfortunately, the Chevy NASCAR would stall off the line, dumping him right to the very back. As we run through the S's, it's 3 wide, it might have even been 4 wide at one point. And, the two Toyotas that were leading the charge here for the NASCARs were not slow. As we come down this back straight, I go to the outside of the BMW as we fire our way through the bus stop. I would keep my car alongside. The BMW is of course going to come back through this long turn. It's quick through the corners, but it's not fast enough. While he did have the inside line, it wasn't enough to get the position back, and of course then we had a little bit of an acceleration zone that I could make the most of the NASCAR power. Now, the Ford GT was always likely to be a very, very quick car, and yeah, it pretty much destroyed the field around here. No one massively surprised by that one. Very, very quick through the corners and quick on the straights as well. No match for the NASCARs in terms of straight line speed, but compared to the rest of the vehicles, it would breeze past most of them, although could still get things wrong with the car. Bouncing it across the curbs, ends up with a wheel on the grass on the outside at the exit of the bus stop. Not quite where you want to be. The BMW is not going to give up that easily. Dives back up the inside to try and reclaim his position, but the Ford is just that bit too quick as we run up towards the second to last corner here. I mean, this is all helping me out massively. You can see my orange Toyota growing ever closer to this fight. The more that they squabbled for that second place, the better it was for me. A little bit further back, a Jaguar was frantically trying to fend off the Toyota here, trying to do what he could, but again, the NASCAR making the most of that straight line speed on the run into turn one. Yes, under brakes, these were nowhere near as good as the GT. I say nowhere near as good as the GT cars. Yeah, the GT cars could outbrake them, but it wasn't by as much as you might expect. Now, considering these are probably 500 pounds heavier than most of the cars that they are racing against, it was still able to really trouble the GT cars at time. And then, of course, whenever we got to any length of straight, the NASCAR would come soaring past, and the GT cars weren't fast enough, with the exception of the likes of the Ford GT that could simply drive around the outside of them. The rest of the cars couldn't. They just didn't have the excess quarter speed over the NASCARs to simply breeze past them, which was actually making for a really rather interesting race. I was charging my way towards the podium, trying to chase down that BMW Z4, and as soon as we got to a straight, I would come flying past. The BMWs were struggling a little bit in terms of straight line speed. Very, very quick through the turns, but they were struggling down the straights, even amongst the GT cars when they were fighting with each other. The BMW struggling a little bit for that speed. Of course, round the corners, the Z4 was very quick, gets to the outside, gets a good run down towards this penultimate turn, but is never going to be close enough. Up ahead, the Ford GT is busy fighting with the Corvette over the lead. This battle was costing us a little bit. The Aston Martin DBR9 was coming to join in, and that is again another very, very fast car in this field. BMW would get the move done at the final turn. A good pass from the BMW, but again, no real trouble for me. I can dive up the inside into turn 1, force him to go the long way around, make the most of my acceleration. I did catch out the Aston Martin a little bit. I was braking a bit earlier, certainly than the DBR9 would be needing to down that section, but as we run up through the S's, I was carrying as much speed as the Aston Martin, and once we'd crested the top of that hill and we're down this straight, I could pull a little bit, not much over that Aston, but pull a little bit of a gap. The green Toyota was continuing to make its way up through the field. It was now his turn to catch up to the BMW. BMW was fighting with the Bentley running out of grip on the outside, having to slightly abort that corner, running very, very wide. But these Nascars were really holding their own. Thinks about having a go up the inside into the penultimate corner, not quite able to get a move done there, and unfortunately for the number 19, a wheel on the grass into the final turn would then leave him out really rather wide. The Bentley now a little bit of a threat, but once more just managing to accelerate away enough by the time they got to that first turn. Further back, the M3 and Ford would have a little bit of a coming together relatively early on. They would get dumped well down the order, although would end up fighting with one another. And much a similar story as we had seen throughout the race. The Nascar, very, very quick in a straight line, able to breeze past the BMW before we got to turn 1. And the GT car not quite quick enough through these turns. It couldn't make up the time required through the corners to get a pass sort of redone on the Ford. At the front, the Ford GT, though, would go on to take victory, and perhaps, unsurprisingly, about 2 seconds a lap quicker than the rest of the field. The GT, an incredibly quick car, and there was nothing the rest of us could do about it. As I said, while a lot of the cars were struggling with finding ways past the Nascar, this could get past just about everything in the field. 4th place would be the highest placed Nascar. Unfortunately for me, while I was fighting with the Aston Martin, I put a wheel on the grass in the braking zone and would drop myself much down the order. I was on course for fighting with a podium. Lap time wise, were very, very similar. I was running very similar lap times. I think I was quicker than most of the GT cars, a little bit down on the DBR9. And, the NASCARs were really quite up there. You see the group of cars fighting behind for sort of 5th and back. The NASCARs really held their own, but that was perhaps not too surprising at Watkins Glen. How about if we were to take the cars somewhere really outside the NASCAR's comfort zone, the Nürburgring? This is a fearsome track. This is a fearsome track to race around in whatever vehicle you might be driving. It is incredibly technical, it's incredibly narrow. There are many things that can catch you out, and overtaking is not quite impossible, but you have really got to make sure you get everything right if you are going to go for an overtake. At the front of this race, the BMW and Corvette would actually pull out a huge lead early on as they vie for this first position. The Corvette having a look around the outside. That was always going to be a very tough place to get a pass done. The BMW, as we saw at Watkins, could carry very good corner speed, but lacked bit of the sort of top end speed of the Corvette. And as we run, this is one of the fastest corners on the track. The Corvette is around the outside. The BMW backs out in the end, deciding probably better not go too wide through one of the fastest and possibly toughest corners on the track. Now, of the NASCAR, for whatever reason, my livery didn't load properly on this one, so I've got a slightly different livery. Also, ignore the terrible quality of the interior cameras during the replays. Yes, just Forza for you. Anyway, I was in an almighty train of cars. I said overtaking was very difficult around here, and for a large part of this opening lap, we were just a train of very fast race cars It was I think it was a Mercedes SLS that was leading this group, and all of us were trying to find a way past the car ahead, and that slowed all of us down. And yeah, we got a big group like this. You made up places when someone made a mistake. We see the Ford Nascar ran a little bit wide. The Ford GT spots its opportunity and pads. Now that GT, we saw it dominate at Watkins Glen. Nobody had an answer for it, but here, while a very quick car, it was just not able to overtake. You just couldn't do anything through these corners, and we have a Nascar sat in the mix here. I was actually putting a fair bit of pressure on the Bentley trying to find a way past. I again get a bump from the Ford that was not quite expecting me to be as early on the brakes as I was. But this big heavy Nascar is running around the Nürburgring competing with the GT cars. In the end, the Bentley ran wide. I ran a little bit wide. That gave the Ford an opportunity to move up a position, but then he'd go and join the train up ahead, and I would stick with him and come to join in the train myself while Aston Martin was fighting with a Nascar behind us. These cars, I was surprised. I thought when we came to a track like this, when we came to a circuit like the Nürburgring, the NASCARs would really struggle to keep up with your more conventional GT cars. Watkins Glen, perhaps a little bit more understandable, you know, a very, very fast track, this one. And yes, the Nürburgring does have some long straights, but there's so much technical sections for these cars to be running around. But they were really holding their own. The DBR9 was having trouble getting past the Chevy. It took him a long, long time into this race. This is a fair way around the lap before managing to find a way past. Unfortunately for me, I tried going around the outside. Much where you saw the Aston Martin going around the outside of the Chevy, I tried to do that to one of the GT cars, and I ended up out in the weeds. I think I tried to do it to the Lamborghini that these guys have caught up to. It didn't quite work for me, which dropped me down to the back of this little NASCAR battle. But pace-wise, yeah, we were right there at the front, and still these two were battling, while the giant train had lost everybody heaps of time over these two cars. They were slowing each other down now as they fought for position. The Corvette running a little bit wide. BMW, I think, out on the curb very, very sideways. And this latter half of the lap at Nürburgring is a very technical part. It's fairly slow corners around here, and that is where the BMW was always likely to excel. But yeah, some quite close racing and not really another car in sight. The Ford GT still marred down in traffic at this stage. Such a quick car like that was very much stuck in traffic throughout this race. And I was stuck in, well, another battle, really. There were kind of two big battles that were going on at the start of this race. From third back, there was one group, and then we had this NASCAR group. Now, actual lap speed-wise, we were catching the group up ahead, but they did have a fairly large margin over, you know, us lot who had been fighting. Well, I'd made a mistake and dropped back into this group that had been fighting a lot on the opening lap. One of the slight downsides to Nürburgring often can get quite spread out as we go for a big slipstream down the main straight to try and catch up to the further ahead groups. Back to the front, and the BMW had led coming on to the main straight for the first time. However, the Corvette, that little bit too fast in a straight line, would find its way past the BMW and manage to be relatively safe coming in to these final couple of corners to end the first lap. These guys are having an incredible battle. To have done a lap of the Nürburgring and been separated by that little, and having done a lap of proper racing and overtaking each other, was pretty good going. As we came to the second lap, as I said, the field was spreading out a little bit with the varying performance of each vehicle. The Aston Martin here trying frantically to find a way past the Jaguar. Again, Aston Martin a quicker car, but trying to get an overtake, trying to find a place where you could get past somebody here was difficult. If you wanted to get it done, you'd have to be brave, and that is a long way. The Aston Martin this time getting it right, long way around the outside there. That's not an easy corner to be making manoeuvres stick. The NASCARs, the Chevy and Ford, would be more involved in this race. Yes, they were a little bit further down the order. You kind of saw why, though, with the early groupings and so on. They were both ahead of the Bentley and Lamborghini GT cars, and they were running fairly closely on track at this stage. Yeah, the NASCARs weren't struggling particularly around it. I really did expect to see them sort of down the back and struggling to keep up. That was not the case. I had spent most of my second lap looking at the back of a Mercedes. Unfortunately for me, the other Toyota had got a move done quite quickly in getting past the SLS, and I just wasn't quite able to. I wasn't quite in a position, and as we came through this latter section of the lap, I just couldn't find an opportunity, couldn't find an opening to get past. I'd have to be a little bit patient. In the end, of course, as we came onto the long straight, well, time for the use of some power. I would then get a move done. It cost me a little bit in terms of time. I wasn't quite able to fight with the cars further up. Speaking of lost time, the Ford GT have been so dominant at Watkins, only took the lead by the end of the main straight on the second lap. That's how much time this car lost in the early battles to the leader. The Ford GT here is by far the vastly quickest car around a circuit, but you could lose so much time stuck in traffic here that it would take until the very, very end of the race for it to claim victory ahead of the Corvette in second, with the BMW claiming third. Now, of the Nascars, again, it was the green Toyota that would be the highest placed of us, trying to go for another couple of positions on the final corner. Got a little bit squeezed out. There just wasn't quite room to get alongside the Aston Martin. He had a go. He went for it on this final lap. Couldn't quite do it. I would now catch up as well. And the Jaguar had been losing time. Jaguar actually had a fairly big gap starting this second lap to both me and the 19. But we had closed right up by the end of the end of the race. The finishing position for the Toyota, though, we would get 7th and 8th in this. Not our greatest finishing position, but there we go. The Ford and Chevy continued their battle right till the very, very end, with the Ford just managing to get it, having made a mistake in the braking of the sort of third to last corner. Ford very nearly threw it away, got very lucky with the Chevy running wide. Having completed the races, they then went to do a drag race to see how this lot of cars would fare against one another. Slightly unusual test for race cars, but never mind. The Lamborghini gets an absolutely incredible start, and that is off. And while the Nascars struggle to put their power down, once they do, they are really soaring. We get past Jaguar and Ford we were closing very quickly on the Bentley and the BMW, but was just a little bit too late. Now, we saw this M3 struggle horrendously at Watkins Glen, and the Z4 for that matter, in terms of outright straight line speed, but their launch is incredible. And while the Lamborghini launches very well and is a much faster car in a straight line, the BMW, despite being caught by everything towards the end of this straight, gets such a good launch that it can get itself up into second in the drag race, which is really rather good going. The Z4, again, another car that got passed a lot simply in a straight line. Even better launch from the Z4, but does lack a little bit to the M3. The Lamborghini then goes. The Bentley is off. The Ford is fairly quick, although I think the Ford did get a little bit of wheel spin as well. Quite get the perfect launch, but the Ford is now getting caught by the Nascars. The Corvette on the outside was struggling a little bit for pace. You see what goes wrong with the Nascars. If you get the launch wrong, you can lose a lot of time with the Ford at the back. So our finishing order: Lamborghini, fairly clean margin of victory over the BMW, made entirely from its launch. It was falling back fairly quickly. Bentley claiming third. Fourth would be incredibly close. The Chevy just beat me across the line. I then just by, we're talking a few centimetres, beat the Jaguar, and behind all of us is the Ford GT that was also very, very much in the mix there. The Z4 would follow ahead of the Corvette, and the Ford had a very wheel-spinny start, and you can see how much time that can lose you. For our final of the tests, again another unusual one for a race car, but I wanted to try the 0 to 100 to 0 with these. I've done it with various road cars. I didn't really know how these cars would fare. Of course, it tests not only launch and acceleration, but you've also got the braking of the cars. I was expecting the Nascars to struggle a fair bit in this particular test. The Z4 would go out first, set a benchmark. The Jaguar would then go and beat it. We're not talking by huge margins here, but the Jaguar would stop a little bit quicker. The M3, with its phenomenal launch, was to go that little bit better than the Jag. Ignore the slight lag going on in the replays. The Bentley gets a fantastic run in this one. Weren't quite expecting the Bentley to do that well. I'm going to say it was the almighty wing. That's what did it. The first of the Nascars, the Ford would get a better start this time around, and while it doesn't beat the likes of the Jag, it stops about the same as the Z4. I would get an even better launch than the Ford and put my car right in the mix. It was a lot closer than I was expecting. Again, coming back, remember how heavy these NASCARs are. The Chevy, unfortunately, he would struggle with the launch, and that was one thing you did have to be careful with. The GT cars were more forgiving if you got the launch a little bit wrong. The GT would, unsurprisingly, go very, very well. While we saw it could get out-launched by the likes of the M3, it is phenomenal under brakes. The Lamborghini goes next, and that couldn't beat my Toyota. It's, again, it's all very close, but it did get beaten by a NASCAR, and finally the Corvette was to go. It is all very close up in that top sort of corner. So for a sort of proper result, the Ford did take victory, not by a massive margin though, compared with the Bentley. It was, yeah, this was a pretty damn close run thing with all of these vehicles as we pan the camera down. The BMW would get third place. Very good showing for launch in that M3. The Jaguar would be next, just managing to beat my Toyota. Then it's, well, very close between my Toyota and the Corvette. I think I just pipped it, but we're only talking a few millimeters in all of that. Very, very close. And in between us is the Lamborghini that's only, well, a third of a car length further down. But, you know, we were expecting the NASCARs to probably do a little bit worse in this test, be a little bit further off, but they are right there with the GT cars. There we see the Ford and the BMW right close together, and the Chevy was the worst of the lot with a little bit of a less than ideal start. The real, like, the spread of the vehicles, probably the closest we've seen in any showdown, any test I've ever done of this 0 to 100 0. I think this is the closest results from the Ford GT race car to a Chevy NASCAR. So, for conclusion time, well, this wasn't about finding the fastest of the cars. Undoubtedly, the Ford GT would win that competition, but yeah, it is rather unbalanced with all different categories of GT car running in here. This was more about seeing where the NASCARs would fit in, would they be competitive, and so on. And very much so they are. At Watkins Glen, they were running actually quite towards the front. At Nürburgring, you know, we were up there. We were fighting in the large trains to start the lap. Yes, the Ford GT is too quick for them. The Ford GT and the Aston Martin, to an extent as well, were too fast for the NASCARs to deal with. But everything else was, yeah, very much in competition with these vehicles, which I was quite impressed with when we start going to a really technical circuit like Nürburgring. Yeah, of course the NASCAR's always going to be quick down that main back straight, but everywhere else, they still really, really held their own, made for some very, very good racing. And yeah, the NASCARs did not look out of place whatsoever in this field. Not quite the result that I was expecting. I am glad that it is the result that we got. Nevertheless, it was actually very good fun racing these cars. However, that is going to be it for this video, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.